Right. Well, awesome. Thank you everybody so much for joining. Mark, thank you for joining me on this. I am super excited about the next probably 45 minutes to an hour on discussion topics for everybody here. Really, we have, I think, a lot of really good content that we want to talk you guys through. The whole purpose of this session is to be informative in talking about warehousing and warehousing technology. So we're going to be primarily on the distribution side of things, how the world works and where we think there's room for improvement. There's going to be a little bit less product pitching. And so before we get into the topics, maybe we start with some quick introductions of ourselves. So Mark, you obviously have an amazing legacy in the space. Do you mind giving a quick overview of your background?
Sure, thanks. And by the way, thanks for inviting me to this. I think it's going to be a fun session. I started back in the day, in the 80s, actually, the late 80s, before Blue Yonder was called Blue Yonder or JDA or whatever. It was, back in the day, it was McHugh, Freeman and Associates and McHugh Software International. And that's where I came. I was doing this when we still had our company parties at Jim McHugh's house. So I left McHugh in the early 90s, created a company called Software Architects, and we were the inventors of the Mocha warehouse WMS technology and the authors of the WMS that is now the Blue Yonder WMS. After selling that business to McHugh, at the time Red Prairie, I left and created my own implementation company called Get Us ROI, and I've been doing implementations all over the world for the last 25 years, like 17 or 18 countries. And last year, 2023, I joined on, we brought all of our crew, all of our intellectual property over to join Softeon with Jim Heflin, who is the other co-founder of SAI, the company that created the Blue Yonder WMS. So he and I back together after all these years.
So for everybody's sake, right, I like to call Mark the godfather of warehousing technology, just given the legacy in the space, how much he's done in impacting the future of the business. So there's a lot of really good information that's about to come out in the next 30 to 45 minutes, hopefully. My name's Keith Moore. I'm the CEO of AutoScheduler.AI, focused on decision optimization inside of the warehouse and how do you orchestrate many different data siloed systems together so that you have a single common operating picture for running your facilities. But my background's in machine learning and artificial intelligence. So I spent the past 10 years in the AI space, back when it was heuristics to machine learning to, generative algorithms becoming a thing. And then, now particularly we'll touch on the topic of generative AI today and where it fits and where it doesn't fit inside of distribution. So as we get started, Mark, 4 topics we want to try and cover today. Obviously, you guys can all see the title, but want to roll through what's wrong with warehousing and warehousing technology in particular, what we can do about it, how, if you're a company that's thinking about getting started on the data predictive AI journey, how you can start to think about that and start to think about data as an asset to your business and steps you can take, right? This will be very tractable and actionable, hopefully, on your side. We'll talk a little bit about AI, where it fits, where it doesn't fit. And then the last piece is we want to touch on where the world is heading. This is, we want to talk a little bit about the future state of warehousing, what's changed over COVID and where we're going to go. So a lot of good content. Please, everybody, drop as many comments or questions in the chat as you can. Mark and I will try to get to as many as we possibly can during the session. So with that, Mark, I'm going to start with just the easy question for you, kind of given your background, which is what's wrong with warehousing technology today?
Well, first of all, I think it's fair to say it does a lot of things really well, right? To give the vendors and the people that work so hard at it their props, I think that it does things well. I think that the issue that I've had over the past, well, let's say about since 2015, is that it just feels like some of the vendors in the space, some of the WCS vendors, some of the even WMS vendors, still have a very sort of concrete, fenced-in approach to the world that they're in. Like, the four walls, they consider the four walls sort of their venue, their responsibility, and they've been sort of, not sometimes purposely, sometimes not purposefully, locking people out. And I think it has to do with the approach of the way that they've looked at exposing themselves, exposing the abilities that they have to the outside world. It has to do with relative openness to include new technology, and I think it's hindered the adoption of innovation, which to me is one of the most frustrating things. When I go to a show like ProMat or Modex, and you see all of this technology, and frankly, all that technology is like screaming to get to the floor, and it's being stymied a bit by the thought processes around the way the WMSs do things, and or the WCSs, and let's just say some of the incumbent folks out there have a narrow view of the world, and so their inclusion of that technology can tend to be a bit delayed or a bit difficult. And that's, for me, one of the most frustrating things, and what I've been doing in the field for, like I said, about since 2015 or so, to help move things along and help just get all that, like guys like you and other folks that have great technology, great ideas. I just lop them under great innovation, small things, big things, things that are more than just the four walls, like your stuff. I mean, that's really where I think the frustration for me comes, because I hear it from the customers.
Well, and I would agree, right? The concept of a data silo that's kind of the term that you often hear when you're talking about kind of the business economics of warehousing technology. Is we have data silos, and we have our warehouse management system that we're using over here, and a warehouse execution system that is run by the automation vendor over here, and our yard management system over here. And then we have our own homegrown thing for labor planning over here. It is our labor management software over here. And there isn't this uniformity of openness. So what you end up with, and this is one of, I am completely aligned, obviously the session title in openness, is you end up with these siloed systems that all sorts of people are responsible for bridging the gaps. And I think obviously, you're responsible for technology at a vendor. I'm responsible for technology at a vendor. What I find large enterprises that are shipping a lot of goods around the world care about is openness of data and the ability to consolidate across data silos and collaborate cross vendor, which companies I think are getting better at. But I completely agree that some of these organizations and some of the systems that operate will actually impede innovation just by not making that data open and available as a, it's like the don't cheat off my homework kind of play. And, I make all the hand motions here, but I don't know if you have any thoughts on, in particular with that challenge, what are things we as vendors can do, or things that large organizations can be thinking about to move forward and kind of get around this data silo, data openness challenge that exists and impedes innovation?
Yeah, I think it's a terrific point. I think my observation so far is that the folks that are doing that well are inside of organizations that demand those things from their vendors. And I think that that's a precarious position for vendors to be in. And I think it's an unfortunate position for vendors to be in, because, I mean, there's so much data flying around systems, whether it's a WCS system or a WES or even the WMSs, that could be available to folks, but is not, because let's just take the example of a WMS vendor, right? A WMS vendor, I mean, if you look at a WMS, the job of a WMS is to coordinate a series of asynchronous microflows, operational microflows going on in a business and in the facility. And those might be a receiving operation, a put away operation, a replan. Think of each one of those as like a microflow. Well, each one of those is like emitting all kinds of data that the WMS is getting, and then saying, okay, I need to do something with that, but they're not telling anybody else along the way. And it has to do with the historical way we've developed things. Coming from the 90s when we were first, when all the standard products first emerged, really in the 90s, it was like, this is my business, and I'm going to give I'm provide enough information for me to do my business, and then a little bit to the outside world to do labor or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a now, and part of it is back then we just didn't have the technology, right? We were, things were so focused. We were like C based, and even Java, even small application based stuff. But in the last 15, certainly since 2010, or even before that, technology has gotten a lot better about being able to broadcast that sort of thing and make it available. But I think what's happened is people have been slow to get on the bandwagon because there really hasn't been much in it for them, frankly. Like why give out information to other people? It just means that your share of the pie might get smaller. And I think it's incumbent on the vendors to say, look, our role is increasingly going to be a piece of the puzzle that solves the overall strategy of optimizing a warehouse, not the main thing necessarily, or not the thing. And I think that's been a difficult, nut to crack for some people, because it's scary and it has rev, implications that, all of those things have just led to, it's just difficult because we should be emitting more data and sharing more data, but there's just technical and other reasons why we aren't.
So there's a really good question that came up, and it actually leads into something I wanted to talk about, which was, let's make this really tractable. I'd imagine there's some folks in IT organizations listening to this, which is, yes, we as vendors need to share data and we need to put our customers first. I think that's kind of the new age of thinking, and hasn't always been the case with a lot of legacy systems out there. But the question is, like, where does a data warehouse or kind of your air quotes data lake fit in? Because I think everybody's got a different initiative at most of the Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 enterprises. And in your mind, right, is, when you're thinking about openness and standardization across systems, do you need to think about building it yourself? Do you need to think about a single system that's doing it? Are there certain tech stacks that people should look at? Kind of how do you think about the effectiveness of data warehouses across these silos owned by the shipping enterprise?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. My observation is that the folks that are leading this are the customers. The customers are leading the charge in this area because they have the requirements. They have the requirements ultimately they are responsible to report back to their management about what's really going on. And when you have all these siloed elements, these siloed pieces that are giving them some portions of that information, it's been incumbent upon them to do it. So we see a variety of different approaches to data lakes, data warehouses. I think that what's helped a little bit there is there's been much better ability to use replication database. So based on a technology called change data capture, where we can be moving data to a replication database which is really within a second of live data. And then what then can happen is somebody can use that technology to pull into their own formats of a data lake, an Azure, data, something like that. So, but I think the frustrating part for me about that is it's still so dependent on the customer to, make the initiative, and do that on their own based on their requirements. What I personally would like to see is all of the vendors be much more open about, publishing things out to more of a streaming technology like Kafka or something like that. By the way, that's going on in the RFID space, and it's working extremely well. The RFID, some of the newer RFID technology is getting much better in apparel, is getting much better adoption because they're using technology like streaming to get out of this, hey, everything has to be connected to the APIs. Streaming, you can use that information for, package verification. You can use it for, auditing. You can use it for, even like picking potentially and things like that. And you see something like that coming along fairly rapidly because that group of that industry or that portion of things has chosen a much more data-centric approach rather than necessarily just an API-centric approach.
Yep. I'm so aligned with that strategy is make the data available. That needs to be first and foremost. And for the IT folks, just to kind of condense that into something you might be able to take away. And the high points I heard were replication technology already exists out there. People should be leveraging. It's on vendors to make sure that data, it becomes available from their systems. And then if you're building a data lake, using a common streaming platform to publish data, the one addition I would make, Mark, is I would also emphasize the need for designing with intent to use. I have seen a lot of organizations say we have a data lake strategy and we dump everything in the data lake and then it becomes like lake by call, which I believe is the deepest lake in the world and impossible to pull anything out because we never know where anything is.
It's so likely to become a mess, right? The last thing you want, to be able to, the last thing that you want as a person that's in IT that, ready to defend your technology is when someone comes to you and says, hey, we've got all this data in the data lake, why can't I get it? Why can't I get it in a performant way? So yes, I totally agree with you.
I have seen that. And
the one thing I would say though is the other thing I would say is that I think that like on the WMS side, and this is on the WCS side and everything in between, our thought processes around what's important really needs to broaden. Like, historically, WMS is like, basically just worrying about what's important to it. WCS is just worrying about what's important to it. And as an intersection of that, for instance, a WCS might integrate with a WMS and send divert confirms, right? And that's because that's the only thing that WMS is typically really cares about. Me as an employer, I care about recircs. I want to hear about recirculations. I want to get a number. I want to see the number of no reads. I want those things to come over so that I can publish those out to somebody because I guarantee you that somebody will be interested in that. From a metrics perspective, like, we got a lot of no reads. Did we just include a new SKU or a item from a vendor whose maybe their labels are poor? There's so much information that we could get if we all just said, look, I think somebody might be interested in this. Let's go ahead and publish it. With the technology today, it just doesn't cost you that much to toss it out there and just with the thinking that somebody might be interested, in hearing about a particular thing.
Yep. So completely aligned there. And I want to move forward because I think we have a few other things I want to make sure we talk about. One additional question just on the concept of WMS is that a lot of the organizations that I work with are running a fairly legacy WMS. Obviously, there's all sorts of different vendors out there, different solutions for different site types. In your mind, Mark, where do you find where and when is the right time to upgrade a WMS? Because one of the things I hear more often, and it's pretty unfortunate, is we are going to upgrade as soon as support isn't something that, is no longer included in the version that we're running, or, we're willing to pay whatever the differential is to get extended life support on a WMS to avoid upgrading. And I think a lot of organizations view it almost as like open heart surgery, which is like the best case, you keep living. And so in your mind, obviously you're in these shoes every day. When is the right time to think about upgrading a WMS, and how should people frame up that conversation?
Right. I think that's a difficult question because, if you talk to ops, like ops is going to come and say, hey, look, this is all risk and no reward to me. I mean, the best situation is that I can still run tomorrow. Right. And so I think that it's incumbent upon us to do a couple things. First of all, look for opportunities for true ROI, not just, hey, let's make up some ROI to, so that we can, do an upgrade and say, okay, it's going to be an upgrade because we get these additional features. By the way, ops may or may not be asking for, but the features are there. To me, that's a non-starter for that. I think that the technology obsolescence thing is a real live thing. So when you're up against those things, what you prefer to have been doing is sort of work the problem ahead of that. And I think that what we've found is that there's lots of ways to shift yourself, well, to portions of a new version without taking, a big bang approach. So, the question to the vendors would be, can we implement some things ahead of time that get us this new functionality, and we get that stuff going, and then when we do the upgrade, that stuff's there, and we get the current technology or current flows supported that we already have. I think that taking that sort of pragmatic approach is good. And then also, I would say, if you're not up against a technology obsolescence thing, I would start looking for ways to increase the value of your WMS or your system by looking for smart partners like you guys to say, hey, how can I use something like you to increase the value? I've got another 5-10 years of run rate on this technology.
Yep.
And it runs what it does really fine. But if we added your abilities or a WES or some kind of other technology, could we extend the life of that? And that's the area that we're doing a lot of work around. I started looking at that in about 2015 as technologies to allow us to extend the life of even older WMSs, because it is like heart surgery, and it is a big deal to do an upgrade.
Yeah, that's a great comprehensive answer. And I know a lot of folks here are kind of fighting through that. So I'll kind of take it on some of the recommendations you provided on, okay, so maybe you're not upgrading your WMS, you're not going through the whole rip and replace, you're looking at starting a journey. And most companies are now trying to build AI. And there's a bunch of Gartner statistics kind of saying everybody's got some focus of building AI into their operation so that we can streamline decision making, make sure our supply chain's flowing as well as it can. So I want to kind of talk a little bit about recommendations and steps that we can give to people so that they can tractably pick up some information and actually use it on a daily basis for pursuing the AI journey of whatever organization they're within. And I might start on that piece, because one of the most common things I've seen, obviously, when we roll out AutoScheduler to a lot of different sites, is and this is going to be a general AI commentary, not necessarily the AutoScheduler commentary, but I find organizations don't have a good enough data to process map. In that, if you go into a warehouse, any warehouse, and you find the general manager and you say, hey, can you explain your site to me? You're going to get, 100 pages of notes on every single flow in the facility, every single corner case. People really know the operation. Yeah. And then if you go to that same person and you say, great, can you show me all of that in data? And they're going to be like, ooh, well, here's the shipments, and we're going to use this whiteboard over here for this process. And, the yard data, it's a little fuzzy sometimes, and sometimes it's in the YMS and sometimes it's not. And so what I'd encourage, before you even say we're going to use AI, everybody to go and do is build your data process map. What are your processes? What do you have data for? And what are your gaps? If you have gaps, it doesn't mean that you can't use artificial intelligence in some capacity, but you need to understand what the gaps are, because, garbage in, garbage out, probably the most overused AI phrase of all time, but it is true. And so, when I'm thinking about a lot of these organizations, building that map is one of the critical first steps. And I find they jump straight to the AI project without considering the data piece or the change management piece, which we can cover in a little bit. And so, Mark, I wanted to get your take on, if people are looking to find gaps, where do you see more often than not the data gaps, given the technology silos we just talked about?
Yeah. So back to my example of this idea that a WMS is coordinating many different sort of micro flows, small flows within a facility, and they're operating asynchronous to each other. So somebody doing putaways, they might drop it out at an inbound P&D that then causes that to get picked up by somebody else. So you have that staging to workflow, and then you have the put away workflow, but they're asynchronous, but they sort of depend on each other. Mm-hmm. So what's sometimes easiest for folks, for at least when I'm going in, I want to understand the sort of, because even if you don't understand how all the data flows across the entire facility, you can break it down by those microflows. So you can say, hey, look, my inputs for doing this put away is this, and my outputs look like this. And then that gives you an idea of like what's going on in the put away. And if you would do that and say, look, take your 10 most commonly used operational flows and say, what's my starting point, what's my ending point, it gives anybody a lot of information about. And then the thing I like to think about is, what's my starting point, what's my ending point, and does that ending point trigger somebody else's starting point, right? And so if you do it that way, then you have because I mean, these are big systems. These are really big and complicated systems, and you have to tear them down a little bit if you're going to have a prayer, in my opinion, of actually breaking that question down a little bit more. Because then you get down to what's important, what's the important data for this particular operation, for this particular flow, and how is that affected by the external things that are going on in the system. That's how I like to view the data problem.
And I would kind of build on that and say the details matter in this case. I had an engineering manager that used to always say that to me. And any site I go to, I build like a free body diagram, which is like every single flow in the operation. What is the data tied to this flow? Where is it in what system? How do we get it out? And so I'll maybe kind of turn that back to you and say, okay, so if we've built this basically micro flow process, all the inputs and outputs of data and decision making, and people generally say, oh yeah, it's good enough, but no, like getting into the details is critical and actually building it out. If you were to go to a new organization, independent of current work, Softeon, AutoScheduler, and you said, hey, look, you need to invest somewhere to fix this problem, to get this data, at least understand what you have and get these gaps aligned, what would you recommend doing? Like if a company had just so many dollars to invest, where's the first place you'd recommend starting?
Yeah, one of the things that me as a WMS guy, as a warehouse guy, I'm either, an operation guy that knows technology, or a technology guy that knows operations pretty well, depending on who you talk to. I like to think about operations. The biggest issue that I want to understand around an operation is the operational elasticity of the building. So that's me saying, hey, if I if I take a partially filled balloon and push on parts of it, it's going to pop out elsewhere. And so what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to understand what the critical constraints are that are driving the operation. And like, if I can add robotics to picking, but if I got a big problem over in packing, that's the dimension of operational elasticity, but that becomes my critical dimension of the operation. And the thing that I try to do when I go into any place is I look at the flow, and then I look to see where those, where we have latitude, where we have headroom in terms of operational elasticity, and where our bottlenecks are. And obviously this is just a simple way to think of it, but that operational elasticity problem is something that is the very first thing that I'm always looking at.
I think that's great, right? I view that obviously as the kind of mathematician, right? Constraint modeling, and where are your constraints? What are your hard constraints? What are your soft constraints, right? If you're looking at labor, for example, is only a hard constraint if you can't get more people in the building and work overtime, things like that.
Well, I think about it like, when people come and ask us for things like robots, and I look at it and say, okay, so we're going to do the picking. First of all, it's a matter of like, are they looking at robots for scalability? Are they looking at robots for speed? And are they looking at robots for FTE reduction? Those are all pieces. But if they're looking at it for speed, the first question I go to is like, okay, where are we going to blow up? Where is our operational elasticity around shipping then? Like, we're going to squeeze the balloon here, and we're going to pop this big thing out, this big bulge out in shipping, and then have a whole bunch of products sitting there that can't get out the door.
I will never forget walking around, and definitely not going to name names here, but a major CPG warehouse where they had just put in AGVs, automated layer pick, automated case pick, and they were fully mature at this point. Say, great. What is your throughput compared to prior? And it's like, well, we're at 60%. We think we'll get to 100% in the next 2 years. Like, okay, well, obviously your costs have gone down operationally. Well, we're paying a lot of people on the floor to make sure the robots are maintained. And it's like, guys, you got to kind of think through all of the pieces, not just a few of them. And maybe on the last point on this, particularly as we talk about mapping data and the openness of data to process flows in the building. Obviously, through COVID, automation has become more and more prevalent in systems, and you're now dealing cross-vendor, multi-system. How does automation, and in particular, like the introduction of not just maybe one vendor of automation, but multi-vendor automation inside of a facility, impact microflows, general elasticity of facility, and data availability?
Yeah, it's a big problem, right? Because I mean, frankly, there's a lot of WES packages out there that are aimed at a vendor's offering, and so you might have this vendor, their WES can do their stuff, and if you want other technology, they might have another WES. So you have a lot of this technology creeping its way into the plumbing. And, I always think about the more plumbing, the better chance for leaks. So I think that is a thing, right? So like what we've thought about is if we can, again, sort of level up the conversation a little bit so that all the vendors really aren't, there's a big push to APIs and all that. And APIs are fine. APIs are great. APIs solve a particular problem, but when you're parked at the door, when a vendor's parked at the door and say they're API based, and as if that solves every problem, it doesn't, because it doesn't help us expose the data to others. It doesn't help us to make those fragile interfaces into more robust integrations. And so I think what we've thought about is, again, we go back to this idea of having a more of a data stream approach to things, to say, look, if we can get those interfaces to turn into integrations into a data stream, point-to-point interfaces, as you add them, it's a bit like pushing a snowball up a hill. Eventually it comes down on you. And so if you could raise this up again a little bit and say, look, we want to get information into more of an open data stream. Now you can plug vendors in, they can plug into your data stream. You can work it from a functional perspective and say, okay, I get this event when we get an induction, I get this event when, and then we don't care how you're talking to the vendor, how they think an induction work. They just know that they're going to send you an induction event. Yep. And I think that's that technology, as you know, right, that kind of technology has been around for over a decade. It's just been a slow process for some vendors to adopt, because again, they haven't had a lot of motivation to do so, right? Mm-hmm. Because to them, it's their own little worlds that they're working in, and they don't really care. Again, the example that I would say is, there's a bit more work around that going on in the RFID space. I mean, RFID has its own problems, and stuff like that. But the one thing that I have been liking about some of the things that we've been seeing is they're much more open with their data. And so yep. I think that we as vendors really have to say, look, our job is to solve the overall solution of the facility, and we shouldn't be exposing any data to anybody necessary, right?
And again, for everybody listening in, Mark and I are very aligned in our philosophies on how the world needs to work, because Mark's done this and is an expert in the space. I have worked across a variety of other industries outside of supply chain. This is where the world's headed, is how do we get uniformity of data, availability of data, start to remove some of those point-to-point level connections, make sure that you have total data sharing, not only across distribution, but how does distribution impact transportation? How does distribution impact manufacturing and production, which is the tail that wags the dog for anybody listening in that, is tied to a production facility, right? And I want to kind of come back to something earlier you said, because there's a question about it, Mark, and then we can move on to artificial intelligence in the space. But there was just a question on just general technology maturity in warehousing. And the question was, with today's cloud-based technologies that really have capabilities to openly integrate with external applications, is the pain of upgrading itself the challenge more so than the lack of need when people are thinking about upgrading a WMS?
Yeah, so I think that the issue that I see, and the issue that sort of we've been battling against, I've started thinking about this around 2015, is that in order for us to be inclusive, ultimately inclusive of technologies, we also have to mind the fact that we get the fact that there's a pragmatic problem in place, which is software is going to be changing. Software is going to need to be updated. Software, might get a wholesale replacement. And how do you do that? So I think from our perspective, what we've been doing is externalizing the integration portion and externalizing, the way, again, we'll externalize the way those APIs are called back into the WMS so that as you upgrade, all that's externalized. You can test it ahead of time. It's not all wrapped up in the WMS. The historical problem that we had, like back when I was designing things, in the 90s, is it was the WMS, there was an integration platform in there, it was all in there, and you couldn't separate it because the integration platform is inherent in the way that the WMS talks to things. And what needs to happen,
the whole concept of monoliths, right? Monolithic software is what warehousing is used to.
Exactly.
Which I think has inherently made people reticent to move to cloud latency as well. But sorry, please continue.
Yeah, but I think that what's happened is there's been, with MuleSoft and Boomi and things like that have come along, they've opened the eyes of IT groups to say, hey, we should externalize that because we get this under our control. We've taken the approach that, in the WMS space, for instance, sometimes we have to have presence on-prem because we have to do things with low latency. Now, it's not a huge percent. I would say 5% of the time we have to do things where we're talking about Pictolites or stuff like that. But from our perspective, externalizing that platform allows us to place it wherever it needs to go, on the prem, in the cloud. And now you have the ultimate in the ability to move. And to the point about the question, because it's externalized, you can basically be testing both systems simultaneously. We actually did this. We had our streaming process go and say, okay, we sent the messages to both systems simultaneously, to the current production system and to the new 2B system. It had, by the way, a wholly different format, and so now you can test, everything. Yeah.
The number of horror stories that come out of that scenario that didn't do that, I'd imagine, is quite large.
Not because otherwise you're testing a little bit on weekends, and we basically, if you're doing this right, you should be able to. If you're passing this through streams correctly, you could test for months and months and months.
So I want to kind of recap everything we just kind of talked about. So we've talked about if you don't have a data openness strategy on how you're going to be leveraging your data, trust me, 3 to 5 years from now, you're going to want it. Not the strategy, the data, meaning you need to build the strategy yesterday. Best time to plant a tree was 100 years ago. Second best time is today. The second piece is you then need to be able to map that data to the microflows that actually make up your operation. And you need to build a process for that. It's not just current state, but future state. Chances are you have an automation project in the works, and you need to do that in a way that accounts for how your data openness strategy and the vendors that you work with are going to support your strategy, right? At the end of the day, our goal is to keep the supply chain frictionlessly flowing. Right. And the next piece then I want to talk a little bit about is data analytics, mathematics, and artificial intelligence. And Mark, if you don't mind, I'm going to go on my high horse for a little bit and just talk about where I see the space going, which is, I've been in this space for a long time. The overall AI space and organizations that provide value in AI are going one of two ways. You either have your research organizations that are like your open AIs of the world, and they are building future state models that can be picked up and used for a variety of different purposes. There aren't many of them. And then there are vertical artificial intelligence platforms and projects that solve. So think of it as like narrow AI is the term that's often used, which is something that replicates human behavior at an extremely rapid rate with high levels of accuracy, predictability, et cetera. And that's where most organizations are really deriving value out of AI, given they have the data strategy and quality, big asterisk on quality, correct. And what I'm starting to see, particularly with the work that we're doing, is more and more organizations are pushing for AI for decision support and decision automation. So this is, particularly in distribution and warehousing, but even outside of that, I get that generative AI gets all of the buzz right now, right? I use ChatGPT 50 times a day for all sorts of different things, but generative AI isn't driving a huge amount of value in distribution. This decision support, narrow AI that helps people synthesize all of this data, see it in a single frame, and then make future state decisions and understand the impact of those future state decisions. You know, more common with like the term control tower, digital twin, those types of things. I think over the next 2 to 3 years, that's really where you're going to see the emergence of AI in our space. And I want to say that up front because I feel like I'd swear every damn question I got, I don't know if I can swear on here, but it's our webinar. So every single question I get on this space from analysts is like, well, what's the application of generative AI in the space? And I can go on a long diatribe on that. But it has relevance. It has future state relevance, and it's really good at some things, but it's not the thing most people are using for AI in the space. So I know you have a really different angle on artificial intelligence in the immediate application. So what are you seeing? Where do you think the world's going to head short term? And then we'll talk a little bit more about generative AI.
Yeah, I think that what's going on is that there's a lot of confusion about, people toss the AI term around as if it's as if saying AI about, in one use case is the same as saying AI in another use case. And it's frustrating because I think that generative AI for us, we're using it, for instance, as a configuration advisor to say, hey, I'd like to set up a new area of the warehouse, and it'll advise you on the steps needed to do that. Or, we use it to, you can basically say, hey, I want to interface to this thing, and you can say, okay, point me at its documentation, and it'll create the transformation document, the transformation interfaces for us to, add to our configurations. Those are great uses of that sort of generative AI. And I think that, I think that what we see is, I think what you're alluding to a little bit is maybe the two other big modes, and you're the expert in this, not me, but I see us looking at both predictive and causal AI as the things that we're looking at. Predictive, like, saying, hey, we want to predict, when we actually need to do the replens instead of having this crazy min-max, thing that is sort of, it's an analog for I need to replen.
Replace heuristics with AI. Great.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's a frustrating thing for me, because that's one of the big use cases that I'd like to do, because as I always tell you, like, the only thing worse than a replen is the next replen. So, we want to make sure that those are non-revenue generating movements, right? That's $2 to pick it up, $2 to put it down, or whatever your costs are associated with moving, cost of the device, etc. And so you want to make sure that those movements are needed, not just, oh, I hit a min that, arbitrarily may or may not work.
I'm going to really quickly just call something out, because it's really important what you just said. And I doubt, I'm not sure how many people noticed it, but if you went to any organization today and said, what is the cost of a replen to you? I doubt many people would have a good answer. And that's a shame, right? Particularly, part of what we're talking about in all of this data openness is the goal of a warehouse is to maximize service and minimize cost, meaning you need to know, and you need to be able to ascribe a dollar amount to anything, so that you're understanding, when you're building new initiatives, what is it actually saving you and what is it gaining you? Right. And another one I could probably go on a long diatribe on is warehouse additions to top line revenue and business, and how it's always forgotten and nobody cares about it so long as you hit a fill rate above X%. And that's another example of what you mentioned earlier, of a heuristic that doesn't do the business justice, but it was put into place for reporting purposes, and so people can say they're doing their job well. I want to really, you mentioned, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. I think that it comes from a place of a little bit of a more older style view of what data, what metrics, KPIs can be pulled from your WMS. And so people are relying on those because they are probably a least common denominator of data that can be gotten from a warehouse system.
Well, and particularly in complex networks that have many different WMSs, different systems running in different places, like that uniformity is critical, and you end up with the lowest common denominator a lot of times, which is a shame. I want to really quickly, you talked about causal AI, and I cut you off, and I apologize for that. Can you share a little bit about some of the causal AI work your team's been doing?
Yeah, so if you think about like the way we like to think about things in terms of those, we're orienting ourselves more toward a little bit more of a headless approach, where it's actions that are going in, sort of, and observations coming out. And if we get to a world where we can pick up data from robots, some of the robots are very yucky, and I like it, very yucky about what they're doing. Like, they can tell us when they're traveling, they can tell us when they're stopped, they can tell us when they hit an obstacle. I want to hear all that information. I would want to hear all that information. And if you have a data stream approach, a streaming data approach to that, now you can start to say, okay, well, how come, if your metrics are showing you, how come, whenever we have robots move in this aisle, they're moving at a slower rate, right? Or how come, when we access these sets of locations, our human team members are taking longer to do these things? It's the basically why and how come question, right, that we're trying to solve with more of that sort of causal AI approach.
And that's a really good segue into what generative AI is good at, because I've gotten the question on, can generative AI run a warehouse? It's nowhere close, guys. I can go ahead and say that fairly confidently. But to explain what it is really good at, and this is, I'll try to demystify a lot of the buzz. I'll tell a quick story about generative AI, which is about 2 years ago at this point. ChatGPT had just come out, or was fairly fresh. I am a power user of anything new and exciting in the AI space, so I'm obviously using it all the time. My wife, at about 11 o'clock at night, is like, "Hey, Keith, I think the dog has something wrong with it. Do you want to take it to the vet?" And in standard loving fashion, I'm like, "Nah, he's fine. We'll go in the morning if he's still having a problem." And 30 minutes later, she's like, "No, I think something's really wrong with him. You should take him to the emergency vet, or we need to figure out a way to do it. We have kids. It's hard to do." So I sit there and I'm Googling all of these things, like, "Hey, my dog's breathing heavily. What's going on? He seems like he's struggling. He's on the floor." I end up on, anybody who's Googled an illness knows how this went. I spent an hour Googling things, got absolutely nowhere. I then turned to ChatGPT and said, "Hey, my dog seems to have a problem. He's laying on the floor. Can you help me understand what it is?" And this is 2 versions ago. And it said, "Hey, well, I'm not a veterinarian, but here are some things you can try." And I put in the answer and said, "Okay, well, were his gums white or were they pink? Okay, go look. All right, they're white. All right, well, are his feet warm or are they cold? All right, his feet are cold. You need to take your dog to the vet. He probably has internal bleeding and he's going to die soon." I'm paraphrasing a little bit because it does a much better job than I'm expressing. Sure enough, take him to the vet. His spleen had ruptured. And had I waited until the morning, he would have passed. I would never have figured that out on Google. It took the knowledge of the world, particularly about a Brittany Spaniel, and ended up saving my dog's life because it was able to distill it in a way that was causal and explainable, Mark. So to tie it back to your point, and that's a really good fit for generative AI in our space, in that it may not be the thing that runs the warehouse, but it can explain how all of these complex systems and complex data sources interact in a way that is then human readable and spits out bullet points on, here's what you need to do and why you need to do it, which is a big challenge for traditional machine learning or optimization models today.
Yeah, and I think with the point that you just described is a really good one, in that you basically took a both causal and generative AI approach, and this is something that we're looking at as well, is that generative AI is going to give us models and data sets that we can say, okay, here's the things that we're seeing, right? And the generative AI will allow us to have an easy way to interact with it.
Yep.
Right? And so I think that's to the point. I mean, predictive and generative, predictive and causal AI in the WMS are going to be the big drivers for productivity, but I think that generative AI is going to be the part that unlocks it from the user's perspective.
Man. Okay. Well, I was just given the 10-minute warning by my next meeting. And so I don't want to hold these good people here for the full hour. Maybe, Mark, just as we think about, obviously, data, openness, decision-making, how the supply chain runs, if you were to look forward 5 to 10 years, and this will be the last question, where do you see the world going? What's going to change? And what are the key things we need to think about now to get there?
I think I think it's going to all be about, it's going to be entirely about data, as we've been discussing. I think that vendors and innovators that are stingy about their data and don't have a good data strategy are going to be relegated to the either just to the sidelines or eventually to the scrap heap. So I think that having good data strategies, sharing that data in a more ubiquitous way using streaming processing, whatever next thing comes down the line, is going to be the key to unlock value. The supply chain is a continuum. It's not silos. The reality is, like, some people think about the four walls, because I don't think about the four walls, but the four walls of a warehouse are part of a continuum, right? And we have to stop thinking about all of these silos, all of this data as silos, and participate in that continuum to bring the best value and allow folks like you and the AI side to bring value, create a multiplicative effect of the value of that data.
And I'll take that one step further, right? Completely aligned again on the need for data openness and the strategy and the process mapping. But I'll also say the focus in 5 to 10 years is going to be much more so on modularity of system around that data, right? So the data is king. Everybody, or maybe not everybody, but there's the analogy of, data is like oil. It's super valuable. You need to figure out how to use it. If you didn't start that strategy 5 years ago, you need to start now. But then for the systems that you're introducing, right, this move away from monolithic software in warehousing, particularly as, I had an automation vendor say this to me the other day, which is some of the hardware is commoditizable at this point. Yeah. And that's, not completely true, but maybe in some types of systems it may be. And you need to really focus on building modularity of system into your operation. Mm-hmm. The world is going to change a lot in 5 years and in 10 years, right? And so being stuck with a monolithic system that you can't rip and replace or can't change or can't build on top of is going to be a massive detriment 5 to 10 years down the road, when you need to be moving at the speed of business. And the business is moving faster and faster and faster in the warehouse, thanks to huge investments from groups like Amazon, where everybody else is trying to keep up. So independent of the data point, I will say in 5 to 10 years, there is going to be a major focus on modularity of software and working with vendors like a Softeon, like an AutoScheduler, where focusing on the customer and building modular data in, data out systems is value add and easy to introduce into the supply chain.
Yeah. The one thing I would say that you're relating to here is that the data, the modularity of the data, along those, we talked about those micro flows, having those independent is super important. And it is not just when somebody says to me, he says to you, okay, we have APIs for that. That is just a portion of this, right? What we're talking about, right? Openness is more than just having an API. It's about openness of your data and in just the way your product flows and how your innovation can extend. So that's
it has to be an organizational philosophy. That's my take on it.
Yeah, exactly right.
All right. Well, Mark, I really appreciate having you. Thank you so much for spending an hour of your time chatting with me on some of my favorite topics. For everybody that listened in, I know there were a lot of awesome questions and comments that came in towards the end. I apologize for not getting to every single one of them, but thank you guys for the engagement. Really appreciate it. With that, I see our wonderful moderator is here to probably wrap us up.
Hello. Great. Yes. Thank you both. And, if there are questions, I'm overlaying Lisa Pooley's contact information. Please reach out to her. And yeah, we appreciate everything. Like I said, the replay will be available. And thanks, guys.
Happy Halloween, everybody. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.